Imagine this. What if all of our history is just the tip of the iceberg? What if at our origins stand not just ancient gods, but something far more ancient and powerful? What if what we considered myths are actually encrypted memories of events that fundamentally change the course of human civilization? And what if the main reason you've never heard the real truth lies not in the absence of evidence, but in the fact that this evidence is too dangerous? Dangerous for those who built our world on a foundation of lies. We have discovered traces that lead to revelations so shocking that they have to be hidden. Imagine gods who, as it turned out, were not gods in our understanding at all. Beings who did not just rule, but created us, not for good, not out of love, but for some dark, pragmatic reason. And that reason might send shivers down your spine. So, let's embark on a fascinating journey to debunk myths and touch the origins of our civilization, relying on undeniable facts. We will not consider the topic of the Anunnaki as some fantastic fiction or conspiracy theory. On the contrary, we will show that this subject is rooted in real scientific and archaeological discoveries. The truth is that this topic does not receive wide coverage for one simple reason. The conclusions it leads to often contradict established theological doctrines. The Anunnaki are not a myth, but a science that can change our perception of the world. This topic is undoubtedly fascinating. It breaks down barriers to conventional thinking and opens up new horizons for us. Perhaps you are already familiar with the stories told based on Sumerian clay tablets that tell of aliens from the planet Nibiru who mined gold and created humanity through genetic manipulation to perform their tasks. And of course, you probably have questions. Who stood above the Anunnaki? What generates so much contradictory information in our time? Here, we will present you with a reliable source of knowledge based on research and conclusions of scientists. This will not just be a lecture, but a holistic presentation that we will build step by step, like a building. Therefore, we ask you to take this material seriously and go to the very end. Don't be surprised if some points seem contradictory to what you may have heard before. Our goal is not to refute other points of view, but to provide a solid foundation, a scientific basis from which we can start for further reflection and assumptions. Our story begins with Sumer, the first known civilization in human history. Before that, people led a nomadic lifestyle. You may ask, what about India or Göbekli Tepe in Turkey? Historians and archaeologists agree. It was Sumer that became the cradle of civilization. If there were earlier developed civilizations with an organized social structure, laws, agriculture, and architecture, they, unfortunately, did not leave us written evidence. To date, based on available archaeological data and written sources, it is Sumer that is considered the first documented civilization. Before that, people and hominids certainly existed, but they led a primitive, nomadic lifestyle. Göbekli Tepe, which is about 12,000 years old, predates Sumer, but does not represent such an advanced civilization. Sumer, on the other hand, is estimated to have originated between the 6th and 2nd millennia BC. This period coincides with the so-called Neolithic Revolution, the beginning of settled agriculture, the development of water resources, the development of knowledge about the cultivation of plants, grains, and animal husbandry. It was these achievements that became the catalyst for the emergence of civilization, marking the transition of mankind from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic, from hunter-gatherers to settled communities, with developed agriculture and animal husbandry. Until the mid-19th century, this knowledge was virtually inaccessible. Everything changed thanks to the excavations led by Austin Henry Layard, an employee of the British Museum, with the support of other major museums in the world. It was during these works in modern Iraq that the Library of Nineveh was discovered. Tens of thousands of clay tablets were found, inscribed with cuneiform, the oldest form of writing, which existed for more than 3,000 years and is older than Egyptian hieroglyphs. Confidence in the authenticity of these texts is given by the Behistun inscription, a translingual inscription, that is, written in several languages. It was thanks to it that scientists were able to decipher the content of the tablets with high accuracy. These tablets contain not only mythological information or texts about the Anunnaki. There we find commercial documents, laws, hymns to the gods, records of customs, schools, an entire cross-section of life at that time. Until the 19th century, we knew very little about the first civilization. Only after the discovery of the Library of Nineveh, the Behistun inscription, and the subsequent in-depth study of these texts, did we begin to unravel these mysteries. And everything I'm telling you is based on historical and even scientific data gleaned from the works of such outstanding scholars as Samuel Noah Kramer, George Smith, Henry Freeman, Jeremy Black, and many other Assyriologists, true experts in this field. In all their works, the main idea is, it all started in Sumer. The Sumerians made a colossal contribution to the development of mankind. They invented the sexagesimal number system. Using the phalanges of their fingers, they could count up to 12 with one hand, which greatly simplified trade. It was they who laid the foundation for our modern calculation of time, a day divided into 12 hours, 12 months of the year, 12 signs of the zodiac. Many uses of the number 12, which seems to have some sacred meaning. The Sumerians were the first to turn their eyes to the sky, seeking to understand the movement of the stars, their influence on life, on the harvest, on sowing and harvesting work. Astronomy and astrology were born there, in Sumer, within their time calculation system. They organized the year into 12 months and 360 days. This calendar principle influenced many ancient cultures, including Babylonian and even Jewish, which testifies to the deep resonance of Sumerian knowledge through the ages. The Sumerians were the first legislators. The oldest code of laws known to us is not the famous Code of Hammurabi, but the Code of Ur-Nammu. It is the earliest legal document of Sumer. Together with them, the first wheeled vehicles, drawn by donkeys, appeared. Agriculture and animal husbandry began to develop, and the first schools appeared. And as researchers, such as Samuel Noah Kramer, note, studying in those schools was not easy. It was in Sumer that irrigation and drainage systems originated. The list of their achievements is huge, and it all comes from Sumer. Most of our modern social organization originates there. They were the first to start writing, and it is in those 30 to 50,000 tablets of the Library of Nineveh that we find commercial documents, records of customs, and much more. The Library of Nineveh, although it arose much later than the Sumerian civilization itself, belongs to King Ashurbanipal II. He did a colossal job of archiving and preserving these documents, collecting in his library texts written long before his time. Here we find documents in Sumerian, Akkadian, and Assyrian. The significance of the Library of Nineveh is so great that it is often compared to the Library of Alexandria, as it represents one of the greatest examples of the preservation of accumulated knowledge in the ancient world. In the Sumerian worldview, captured on the tablets, the earth was represented as a disk. Yes, that's right, a flat earth. That was the representation that existed 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. Above this disk was the celestial vault, called An. This was a universal principle. The sky was called An, and we do not yet associate this name with the god An or Anu. The place where they were located was called Ki, earth. The separation between heaven and earth was called Lil. This word is very reminiscent of the name Elil. En means Lord, and Lil can be translated as wind, matter, breath, or space. This is what filled An, the sky, and Kai, the earth. Lil was between them, and under all this was the underworld, the world of the departed. That is where the soul or spirit of the one who had passed away went. With this in mind, the Sumerians explained on the tablets how and why they were created. They had no doubts. They were confident in their purpose. They did not have the modern dilemma, so common today, regarding free will. The Sumerians, who also laid the foundations of mathematics and philosophy, had no doubts. They knew with absolute certainty they were created to serve the gods. Their life was dedicated to them. Without the slightest doubt, they were created to serve. Their lives belonged to the gods. Period. Later, ziggurats will appear in Sumer itself, but we will talk about this a little later. First, about Sumerian myths. There are many myths about the creation of the world. Among them are Enuma Elish, the Epic of Gilgamesh, Enki and Ninhursag, Enki and the World Order, and others. The Sumerians were categorical in one thing. Before the appearance of people on earth, gods lived, and they did not just live, but worked. Men and women, gods and goddesses, they all lived here, on earth. They cultivated the land, built, performed various works. But there came a moment when these gods grew tired of work, and then they created humanity. They created them to serve. This story is repeated on various tablets, emphasizing that the creation of man had a specific functional purpose. This has no moral coloring. It is a function. Man was created as part of the mechanism of the universe. And where can all this be found? In Mesopotamian tablets, stored in museums around the world. These men and women, gods and goddesses, worked on earth, on the planet, cultivated fields, built. But they got tired of work, and then they created people so that they could serve them. People, the Sumerians, were created to serve the gods. They had no doubts about this. The Sumerians called themselves black-headed, both men and women. This was their self-designation. The word Sumerians was given to them by other peoples later. They did not call themselves that. Sumer means land of civilized kings, and this region arose between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia. And Mesopotamia, as the name suggests, means land between the rivers. I hope I am speaking slowly enough so that you can historically understand what all this means. I sincerely hope you are listening carefully. The Sumerians worshipped various gods. Monotheism did not exist then. This worldview, which speaks of An, Kai, and the underworld, where everything is united, matter, breath, air, space between heaven and earth, will later find its embodiment in the Sumerian myths themselves. Among the gods present in Sumerian mythology is the god An, or Anu. It is the same God. An is the Sumerian name. Anu is the Akkadian name. As I mentioned earlier, the Library of Nineveh appeared much later than Sumer. Its discovery occurred in the 19th century, but the formation of the Library of Nineveh's collection occurred much later, historically. Therefore, we will encounter texts where this god is called An, and in others, Anu. But it is the same god. The same thing happens with Ea and Enki, as well as with the goddess Inanna and Ishtar. It is the same goddess. Such variations in names are explained by the transition between Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian cultures, which preserve the same divine characters under different languages and dialects. This is a kind of mythological translation that accompanied the expansion of Mesopotamian civilizations. If you want to study this topic in more detail, you can visit museums such as the British Museum and search for Sumerian myths in English. You will find texts praising the gods, showing families gathering because of illness and praying to Inanna or other gods for healing, especially Enki. Enki was a god associated with magic, magical healing, spells, and exorcism. There are texts in which Enki exorcises demons. It is worth noting that at that time, demon did not mean an evil spirit. Demon simply meant spirit, and that's all. In the Sumerian worldview, there was no idea of a single god. The gods were sovereign. They made absolute decisions. And this sovereignty of the Sumerian gods is comparable to the gods of other ancient mythologies, Greek, Roman, and even Scandinavian. Like the Greek and Roman gods, the gods of Sumer, Akkad, and Assyria were sovereign. And what does this mean? That they were not good or bad. They just were. They made decisions. And it didn't matter whether the decision was good or bad. It was made. Point. Just like in Greek mythology, when Zeus decides something, he decides, and that's all. It didn't matter whether it was fair or not. He just did it. The same with Odin in Scandinavian mythology. Thus, the Sumerian worldview is completely different from what we see today. As I said, there was no idea of a single god. The Anunnaki are the gods of the Sumerians, Akkadians, and Assyrians. What does the term Anunnaki mean? Many say that Anunnaki means those who came from heaven to earth. This idea, for example, is supported by Zecharia Sitchin, but other specialists, especially those more connected with the academic environment, say that Anunnaki means children of the god Anu, or offspring of the prince. If you think about it, Kai is the earth, An is the sky. Thus, these gods, the Anunnaki, being children of Anu, and Anu is a universal principle, the celestial vault. Everything that comes from Anu comes straight from heaven. So yes, you can also say that the Anunnaki are those who came from heaven to earth. Until now, we haven't talked about aliens, but very soon we will. But before that, I need to explain something else to you, because it is important that from this historical point of view, you understand the following. The Egyptians, who appeared centuries later, and other peoples who lived around Sumer, they also worshipped their gods. If we analyze this from a historical, sociological, and archaeological point of view, we cannot say that we are talking about exactly the same gods. This needs to be clearly distinguished. And it is important to remember Göbekli Tepe, this monument built in honor of the gods. But the people who built it did not write anything down. They did not leave written evidence. They did not form an organized civilization like Sumer. Therefore, we cannot claim much about their beliefs. Another important point. about 40,000 eons ago, long before the Sumerian civilization, humans and so-called humanoids were already worshipping gods. Who were these gods? Forces of nature, supernatural entities connected to the earth? Or, for those who believe in spiritualism, were they spiritual consciousnesses? It's impossible to know for sure. But the fact remains, even before the emergence of the first civilization, people were already venerating some form of divinity. And this veneration, this impulse to worship something higher, has been preserved through time. It permeates almost all the peoples of the earth and is imprinted in myths, oral traditions, symbols, and folk documents that have come down to us. Now, could Zeus, Odin, and An be the same? I don't know. But for now, leave that thought aside. Let's look at something else. The Library of Nineveh was discovered, as I mentioned, and there's a text there called The Descent of Inanna to the Underworld. This underworld, or lower world, it's not hell, okay? At that time, there was no concept of hell in our modern understanding. It was simply the world below, the world of the departed. This text, The Descent of Inanna to the Underworld, was fully reconstructed and recognized by scholars only in the 1930s. That is, it hasn't been available in its entirety for even 100 years. And this text is very important. It contains the first mythological description of resurrection, at least 1500 years before the birth of Jesus, and it was discovered very recently on the scale of our history. George Smith, around the 1870s, was studying at the British Museum. He was the one who identified what we now know as the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And it is said, I don't know if it's true, that when he saw there the description of the flood, and that this description was not only connected to the Bible, but also showed that in addition to the single God, there were other gods. He ran out of the museum in his underwear, screaming. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but it shows the impact of that discovery, and most importantly, it shows how recent it is in modern history. These findings were so significant that they completely changed the view of archaeologists and theologians on biblical narratives. For the first time, written evidence appeared, older than the Hebrew text, of a global flood, heroes, gods, and a similar mythological structure. Let's summarize. And also remember what I read in some books, a multitude of books, such as The Invention of God by Thomas Romer, The Bible Unearthed by Israel Finkelstein and Neil Asher Silberman, and other books by Samuel Noah Kramer. These books are the result of years of archaeological and textual research, and they show that the religion of the Old Testament did not arise out of nowhere. It was formed in a context where other gods were already worshipped, and where monotheism was a progressive and strategic construction. We know that in the regions where Yahweh, the supposed one true God, appeared to Abraham, other gods were actually worshipped. What the Jews established was monolatry. Monolatry does not deny the existence of other gods, but prefers to worship one God as the primary one. Our Christian faith, or even the Islamic faith, which are widespread, teach us about a single God. But recent archaeological discoveries show us the opposite. For example, God may have had a wife named Asherah, a name that was omitted from the biblical canon. And all this makes even more sense when we look at the context of Abraham. Abraham did not appear from a religious vacuum. He came from Ur, one of the most important cities of Sumer. in the region that today corresponds to the south of present-day Iraq. Ur was a sacred city dedicated to the lunar god Nana, also known as Nana or Sin. This god was worshipped in two main religious centers of antiquity, in the city of Ur itself, where his great ziggurat stood, a kind of stepped pyramidal temple structure, and also in the city of Haran, located further north, where the family of Terah, Abraham's father, lived for some time. It's no coincidence that Abraham's brother was named Haran, probably a direct reference to this sacred city. And, well, you know what's happening today in those lands, right? To understand some things, you inevitably have to look into the past. After all, modern Iran comes from Persian origins. Going back to ancient times, to antiquity, people really believed that the gods physically resided in the ziggurats. It wasn't just a symbolic construction. It was believed to be a meeting place between gods and humans. The top of the ziggurat was intended for the god, and only the high priest could ascend there. These priests were often not just religious figures. They also possessed political and administrative power, especially in the early cities of Sumer. The highest authority in the city could receive the title Ensi, a kind of priest-ruler, or Lugal, which is closer to the concept of king. Over time, Lugal became the dominant figure, concentrating military, religious, and administrative power. In times when Ur prospered as a religious, cultural, and economic center, kings such as Shulgi, Amarsin, Shusin, and Ibisin marked an entire era. They were all kings of the third dynasty of Ur, one of the last great manifestations of Sumerian civilization before its final fall. These kings maintained a strong symbolic and religious connection with Nana, the lunar god. The king was seen as chosen by the god and legitimized by him. The construction or restoration of ziggurats was part of this divine alliance. Shulgi, for example, restored the great ziggurat of Ur in honor of Nana. Amarsin and Shusin continued centralized and religious administration, building canals, temples, and maintaining worship. But Ibisin, the last king of the dynasty, faced a serious crisis: drought, famine, Amorite invasions, and the collapse of the centralized structure. It was the end of the dynasty and the beginning of a new chapter in the history of Mesopotamia. So when they say that Abraham left Ur and went to the Promised Land, we are not talking about a man born in the desert without any context. We are talking about a man who grew up in a deeply theocratic environment where gods dwell in temples, where the worship of Nana dominated urban life, and where his father, Terah, was probably a priest or participated in religious service. When this monotheistic tradition begins to develop, it carries deep traces and imprints of the polytheistic past, and that is what modern archaeology has revealed. There are scientific articles and books on this topic. Up to this point in this video, we have worked exclusively with historical, archaeological, and scientific data. We haven't even ventured into the realm of conspiracy theories. We have already laid part of the foundation of our building, and now we are starting to consider other perspectives as well. I haven't even talked about the Lost Book of Enki, or the Earth Chronicles series by Sitchin, or the planet Nibiru. The truth is that even without touching on these topics, we can already see how important these discoveries are. We are completely changing the paradigm of our lives and the very paradigm of planet Earth when we realize that at a time when it was said that there was only one God, in reality, Several gods were worshipped. One single god gained dominance, and the others were gradually abandoned, forgotten. This process of erasing polytheism, this is something that can be observed in various religious texts, especially during the reform of Josiah in the Old Testament, when worship centered on Yahweh began to gain exclusivity. The worship of other gods was gradually forbidden. It was erased from human history. But today, archaeology and history already have enough material to tell about what was missed. People have already studied the Anunnaki, have already studied the writing. I mentioned that the text, The Descent of Inanna to the Underworld, was compiled, or rather reconstructed, by scholars only in the 1930s. And why is that? Because these tablets are not in order. They are scattered throughout the library. There are between 30 and 50,000 of them, and only a little over 10% of them have been translated to date. Specialists sometimes don't even manage to put together a complete text. Sometimes it seems that the story is ordered, and suddenly another part appears that doesn't match the previous one. This is the case with the Epic of Gilgamesh. On some tablets, it seems that Enkidu died. On others, that he didn't. I won't explain it to you now. There's a video on the channel about the Epic of Gilgamesh. Just search for it. And there will be more in the future. It is important to understand the following. These tablets are not in order, chronological, and are not unambiguous. You can't just take a ready-made book and say, "Here it is. This is the complete story." That's not how it works. You take one part here, then another part there, and suddenly one doesn't match the other. And then the puzzle begins. The work of specialists, in this sense, is more like archaeological reconstruction than reading a normal book. It's like assembling a mosaic from ceramic shards scattered across a field. And that's how the Anunnaki are studied. That's how the Sumerian tablets are studied. That's how real specialists work with this material. Now let's move on to the very last part of the story. In the 1970s, a man named Zecharia Sitchin published a series of books, 7 books, The Earth Chronicles. Sitchin made many comparisons, and his contribution is huge in what he did. But Sitchin was not a historian. He had a degree in economic history. To say that he was one of the few who could read Sumerian texts, perhaps that would be an exaggeration, because in reality, he was not an academic in this field. He studied economic history, just as I am not an Assyriologist. I am a librarian. I have 2 postgraduate degrees, one of them in philosophy. But I am not an academic historian. I study this as a hobby, just like Sitchin. Only Sitchin's work broke the logic of everything that existed until then. He claimed that he could read Sumerian inscriptions, Assyrian inscriptions, the original Bible, and that he could also study the Phoenicians, Hittites, Hurrians, among other peoples. His theory is outlined in 7 books. The first is The 12th Planet, then The Stairway to Heaven, and then there are others, the names of which I don't remember now. There is also Genesis Revisited, which is a separate book. Years later, he released The Lost Book of Enki. This is a work of fiction. He took everything he had studied, turned it into a narrative, created a story divided into tablets, and there you have it. This is the story we are telling here. This is the basis of the film Anunnaki on the channel. A narrative story, constructed as if you are watching a film. And no, this is not pure fiction. This is important and necessary. You just sit and watch. Don't try to rationalize every detail. Put aside the rational part for a moment. Just watch and see how many things fall into place. See how the genetic experiments that Sitchin proposes actually make sense. Even today, our science is developing similar things. See how the atmospheric problems on Nibiru resemble our own greenhouse effect. Perhaps something similar is happening here too. Even if it is a work of fiction, it is a work of fiction based on real myths. And in this sense, it works as a gateway to knowledge, a bridge between imagination and archaeology. If this story hadn't been written in such a sensational manner, perhaps this topic would never have reached you. Maybe I wouldn't even be here. I myself only started studying all this because many years ago I saw a blog telling the story of the Anunnaki, and I asked myself, could this be true? Then I started reading historical books, archaeological books. I started doing comparative research, and only after all this was I able to understand the importance of Sitchin's work. So, the respect for him is huge. And if you want to know, I believe in a lot of what is written there, but some things need to be said clearly. I see many channels saying, the Sumerian tablets say this, the tablets say that. But the truth is that we don't even know everything they say. Even specialists don't know. And here it is important to clarify a very common misconception. The Sumerians categorically claimed that humans were created to work for the gods, and that the younger gods, called Igigi, were freed from hard labor, created to work. But that is different from being created for slavery. You work too. Are you a slave? Okay. I know that sometimes the system feels like slavery, but technically, it's not slavery. The same is true with the Sumerians. Exaggerating and saying that they were created to be slaves is incorrect. This may be an interpretation that came later, after reading the myths, but you can't say that it is literally written in the tablets. It's not. And that is why we always need a standard, a criterion. Because when studying myths, history, and religion, any slight distortion can become a huge belief. Of course, in the videos here on the channel, I often start with different beliefs and approaches, but my intention will never be to tell you what to believe. My idea is not to limit you. On the contrary, it is to free you from thoughts that can make you a slave to your own beliefs. Because even if some things are not written explicitly there, some things are hidden between the lines, right between the lines. And that is why sometimes I say things explicitly, and sometimes I prefer to leave them implied. Follow that thought. You know what ziggurats are, right? Ziggurats are pyramidal structures. These buildings were created in Sumer, which at that time was not a country in our modern understanding. Sumer was divided into many city-states, like small independent kingdoms, something similar to what we see today in the United States. Each city-state had its own god, and for each god there was a ziggurat. These structures were tall, pyramidal, and served as sacred temples, a place where that god was venerated. Let's look at it from an academic and scientific point of view. Each city had a god, as well as a class of priests. Initially, there was only one priest, but over time this class grew and came to include the king, who, by the way, was the political and religious leader of that city. The king and the priest were the only ones allowed to ascend to the top of the ziggurat, where, theoretically, contact with the gods took place. This marks the beginning of what will later be called theocracy, a rule based on divine power. The idea that the king rules because he was chosen by the gods begins right here, in Sumer. And along with all this, tax payments appeared. If you think paying taxes is bad, and I also think it's very bad, it's worth remembering that from the beginning of history, from the moment state power arose, this already existed. In Sumer, citizens were already paying taxes to kings and priests. And the most curious part, these taxes were given to the priests under the pretext that they would be offered to the city god, there on top of the ziggurat. And they even came back with a receipt for this tax. I'm sorry, I almost said tithe. But this is just to make us think, right? Were these gods really there physically or spiritually? I don't know. And to be honest, I don't even rule out the possibility that it was all a huge invention. Maybe someone created a system, built a structure, and then said, "Now I speak with God." Who knows? Maybe they used some kind of hallucinogens, and in this altered state, it seemed to them that they were communicating with some deity. I don't know that either. Or maybe it was actually physical. Maybe spaceships came down, and a god emerged from these ships right there, on top of the ziggurat. I don't know. But I confess something to you. I get goosebumps just thinking about it. Because I love it. I like this idea. It seems to make sense. But I don't know if it's true. And most importantly, it's not written in the tablets, not in books. It's speculation. And I love these speculations so much that here I am, on this channel, creating videos about it, which I love to make and which you love to watch. And it's not just a question of liking the idea or enjoying creating videos. It is, in fact, the most plausible alternative. The Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings of flesh and blood who came from the heavens to earth. There seems to be no other viable alternative. The only consideration is that mythology and all ancient narratives should not be reduced exclusively to this one interpretation, without appreciating all the beauty of everything else they contain. Now, let me ask another question. Could these Sumerian gods be the same ones that appear in Egyptian, Greek, Roman, Scandinavian mythologies, and even in other world religions? I don't know. And honestly, I think it's premature to make such a comparison. Unless we've read a lot of Sumerian tablets, then yes, with a solid foundation, maybe we could say something. But I've already seen people say, for example, that the lunar god Nana is the same as the supreme god of Islam, Allah. And, honestly, I think it's very premature to make such a statement. Before saying something like that, perhaps we should deeply study the Sumerian texts about Nana. Then, yes, with proper justification, we can think about it. What about Marduk? Could he be Ra? Well, in the Lost Book of Enki, yes, he is. But, really? I don't know. I know that Sitchin said that Marduk is Ra, and I also know that there are scientific articles that examine the similarities between Marduk and Ra. Yes, you heard right. Scientific articles, written by historians and archaeologists. That's the type of material I usually research, read, and obtain to form the knowledge base that I share here on the channel. Scientific information. These articles attempt to draw parallels between the mythological and political structures of Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilizations, comparing, for example, the centralizing role of Marduk in Babylon with the role of Ra in Egypt. Now, does this prove anything? Not necessarily. And that's why I love studying these things so much. But to truly study, sometimes you have to leave things open. Because if we fix something and say, that's it, we're building. But if we build, we lose the basis of the research. We lose the essence of the research. So when someone asks me in the comments, is this really so? Is this true? I answer, maybe. Maybe yes. Maybe no. It is impossible to say for sure. Some people often ask me what the Anunnaki believed in, and I must make this clear. The Anunnaki did not believe in anything. All cultures of our past did not have faith in individual gods, in single gods. There were multiple gods. There were gods, in the plural. There was no mention of a single god, no idea of a creative source of all that exists. The source was in the beginning. It was in Anu, a cosmic force that united everything, and which later even appears in Greek philosophy with Thales of Miletus when he talks about arche, or even in the idea of the demiurge, not the Gnostic demiurge, but the demiurge of the Greek philosophers. So when someone asks what the Anunnaki believed in, well, from a scientific point of view, the Anunnaki did not believe in anything. The Anunnaki are the gods worshipped by the Sumerians. And the Sumerians, yes, they are the ones who can tell us what they believed in. And the Sumerians believed in the Anunnaki. What about Galzu? Well, Galzu is an invention of Zecharia Sitchin, who introduced the concept of the Anunnaki's belief in the Father of all that is, in the Lost Book of Enki. This reflects what he believed in. I confess, I cannot understand why he did it. But the fact is that he did it, and it appears in films on the channel, because I want to respect the conclusions he came to. But it must be clearly understood. From a scientific point of view, this has no basis. The name Galzu is not found in any Mesopotamian tablet, in any document, and is not mentioned by any expert. So, some people ask, are the Anunnaki false gods? No, that's not the point. It's wonderful. The Anunnaki are the first gods worshipped by the first civilization that ever existed on Earth. And this first civilization, Sumer, claims that everything they learned then, measuring time, astronomy, agriculture, animal husbandry, laws, irrigation, the creation of city-states, and a bunch of other things that may not even fit here right now. All of this was delivered by whom? By the gods. The gods taught. And who were these gods? The Anunnaki gods. Are the Anunnaki archons? Well, now we are entering another realm, a more complex realm that requires a deeper explanation of Gnosticism. This will be explored, yes, but not now. And do the Anunnaki control what is happening in the world? This is a question that comes up often. There are channels, theories, videos, forums, and some go very far. There are people who say that Nibiru is a mothership. Others claim that the Anunnaki are hidden, running the world from behind the scenes. And there are even those who swear that they are lizards. Yes, lizards. And where did this lizard story come from? It all starts with an old concept in neuroscience, the so-called reptilian brain. For a long time, scientists divided the human brain into three basic structures, and the most primitive of these, associated with survival instincts, aggression, hunger, fear, and immediate reaction, was nicknamed the reptilian brain. This is because it resembles the brain structure of reptiles and some of the first creatures that emerged from the water. One example, cited in scientific documentaries, is Tiktaalik, one of the first vertebrates with characteristics of both a fish and a land animal. These early animals are thought to have given rise to the instinctive patterns that still inhabit the human brain. Of course, modern neuroscience has revised a lot since then. Today, there is much more talk about the role of the prefrontal cortex, this newer part of the brain responsible for emotional intelligence, conscious choice, and the ability to observe and regulate our own actions. The term reptilian brain is already considered obsolete, but it is this idea of the reptilian brain mixed with ancient symbolism and a good dose of interpretation that has fueled David Icke's theory. According to Icke, the Anunnaki are reptilian beings who have inhabited Earth for millions of years. He suggests that these beings are still among us, having infiltrated the world's power elites, and even links the British royal family to the supposed lineage of these reptilian Anunnaki. It is a theory that for some mixes fiction, belief, and esoteric elements. And it is important to clarify this. Such a view already belongs to the realm of speculation, imagination, belief, and in this area, there is no right or wrong. Everyone is free to form their own views and believe what they want. Now, could the Anunnaki be malevolent beings who still exist today, operating behind the scenes of power? Maybe, but honestly, maybe we don't even need to go that far, because sometimes people themselves manage it very well. Evil, manipulation, exploitation, all this can be produced without any external intervention. People, on their own, have already learned to dominate, exploit, and benefit from the weakness of others. Are the Anunnaki behind this? Maybe, but even if not, evil is already well learned. So, there is no need to blame the reptiles. But in any case, everyone is free to believe in anything. When we wonder if the Anunnaki are still here, perhaps we are not looking in the right place. Instead of looking into the night sky for ships or searching for conspiracies in governments, it is worth looking inward, into the very structure of our society and even into our own psychology. What if their most enduring legacy is not stone monuments or golden artifacts, but the invisible architecture of control, implanted into the very essence of humanity? Sumerian texts are very clear on one thing. We were created for a specific purpose, to serve. But what if this software was not removed after the project was completed? What if it continues to run today, shaping our instincts, beliefs, and social hierarchies? Let's follow this thread. The concept of the divine right of kings, the idea that a ruler is God's anointed and his power is unquestionable, was not born in medieval Europe. Its roots go straight into the fertile soil of Mesopotamia. The Sumerian Lugal was not just a king. He was a representative of God on earth, the only mediator authorized to climb to the top of the ziggurat to communicate with the heavenly lords. This model, where power does not come from the people, but descends from above from some divine source, has proven incredibly effective. It legitimized absolute power, suppressed dissent, and created a rigid hierarchy where the elite at the top were considered genetically or spiritually closer to the gods. Does it not seem to you that this model, changing, has passed through millennia? From the pharaohs, considered living gods, to the monarchs who ruled by the grace of God, and perhaps even to modern dynasties, possessing unimaginable wealth and influence, as if inheriting not just capital, but the very right to command. This power structure is no accident. It is, perhaps, the most persistent social virus that the Anunnaki ever created. But how to maintain control over an ever-growing population through direct coercion. Inefficient. It is much more elegant to create a self-regulating system based on faith. Religion became the ideal tool. It gave answers to existential questions, established moral codes, and, most importantly, promised reward for obedience and punishment for disobedience. But mostly, after the completion of the earthly journey, the priestly caste, which began in Sumer, has become a global institution of mediators between humanity and the divine. They collected taxes for the gods, whether grain in ancient Ur or tithes in the medieval church, and in return offered comfort and hope. This system is ingenious in its simplicity. It shifts the focus from real, earthly rulers to an invisible, omnipotent judge whose will is interpreted by those already in power. Thus, any rebellion against the system becomes not a political act, but blasphemy, a rebellion against God Himself. And here we come to the most disturbing aspect of their legacy. The Anunnaki, being masters of genetics, may have left their mark not only in our social structures, but also in our DNA. We have already talked about the reptilian brain, the source of our basic instincts. Fear, aggression, the desire to dominate and submit to hierarchy. What if this is not just an evolutionary accident? What if these traits were deliberately enhanced? Imagine the ideal worker. He fears authority, strives to take his place in a clear hierarchy, exhibits aggression towards those below or outside his group, and above all values survival and stability, even at the cost of his own freedom. This is not a description of a reptile. This is a description of a huge part of human society throughout its history. Perhaps our propensity for tribalism, xenophobia, blindly following leaders, and willingness to sacrifice ourselves for abstract ideas imposed from above are not flaws in our nature, but built-in features that made us excellent servants. Thus, the legacy of the Anunnaki is something twofold. On the one hand, they gave us fire, knowledge in the field of mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, agriculture. They, in fact, launched our civilization. But on the other hand, they put invisible chains on us, a psychological and possibly genetic predisposition to submission. They gave us the tools to build a world, but put the blueprints of a prison in our hands. And the most ingenious thing about this prison is that we built it ourselves, brick by brick, generation by generation, sincerely believing that we are building a temple. We fight each other for resources that ultimately enrich a small elite. We follow dogmas that divide us and make us manageable. We have created economic systems that encourage labor for survival, not for creativity. This system is so perfect that it no longer needs external overseers. We ourselves have become our own jailers, passing on the keys to the cells to our children under the guise of tradition, culture, and sacred duty. True control is when a slave is not even aware of his shackles and fiercely defends his cage, considering it his home. If the previous chapter painted a grim picture of our programmed existence, then this one is about hope, because in every system, even the most perfect, there is room for failure, for anomaly. And in the case of humanity, this anomaly seems to be our own mind. The very genetic fire that the Anunnaki invested in us turned out to be not just a spark for work, but a flame capable of illuminating the darkness and burning the shackles. We are at a unique point in history. For the first time in thousands of years, information hidden in clay tablets and buried under the sands of time becomes public knowledge. Thanks to excavations, the work of selfless scientists, and of course, the global network, forbidden knowledge is no longer the lot of the chosen few. We are experiencing a collective awakening, slow, painful, but irreversible. We are beginning to read the instruction manual left by our creators, and we understand that it contains not only rules, but also loopholes. To understand this process, let's return to the Sumerian pantheon. Among the Anunnaki, two key figures stood out whose the confrontation has perhaps become a metaphor for all of human history: Enki and Enlil. Enlil was a strict administrator, a commander-in-chief for whom order, discipline, and flawless execution were paramount. He viewed humanity as a resource, a functional tool. According to myths, it was he who was angered by the noise of humans and sent the flood upon them. Enki, on the other hand, was the chief scientist, a brilliant engineer who directly participated in our creation. He showed compassion for his creation, secretly passed on knowledge to people, and saved humanity from the flood by warning his chosen one. Isn't our entire history a battlefield between these two archetypes? Between the legacy of Enlil, the pursuit of order, hierarchy, control, dogma, and the legacy of Enki, the thirst for knowledge, creativity, compassion, individual freedom, and rebellion against unjust power. Every time great thinkers, scientists, artists, and revolutionaries appeared in history, pushing the boundaries of knowledge and challenging established dogmas, wasn't it the voice of Enki echoing through the ages? And every time the Inquisition burned books, when totalitarian regimes destroyed dissenters, when religion demanded blind faith instead of inquiry, wasn't it the shadow of Enlil trying to maintain order and control? Today, this struggle has reached its climax. The Enlil system of control, perfected through global financial structures, media, and political institutions, is faced with the awakening consciousness of Enki, which is spreading through the free flow of information and the growing desire of people for self-determination. This awakening forces us to reconsider the most fundamental question: who is God? The discovery that the ancient gods were beings of flesh and blood, aliens from another planet, does not necessarily lead to atheism. On the contrary, it liberates us. It allows us to separate our creators from the higher, primordial creator, that impersonal, all-encompassing source of being that the Sumerians called An, and philosophers called the Absolute. The Anunnaki were not this source. They were only one of its countless manifestations, an advanced civilization that, in turn, also came from somewhere. Realizing this, we cease to be praying slaves looking up to an all-powerful and often capricious master. We become heirs, younger brothers in reason, who have finally learned the truth about their family. We can respect them as our ancestors, but we are no longer obliged to worship them. Our duty is not to serve them, but to surpass them. How to do it? The path lies through conscious evolution. If they changed our genetics, then we must change our consciousness. This means taking responsibility for our reptilian instincts, not suppressing them, but recognizing and managing them with our developed neocortex. This means questioning any authority that demands blind faith, rather than offering logical arguments. This means developing empathy and unity, understanding that the division into nations, races, and religions is an outdated control mechanism from Enlil's arsenal. This means valuing creativity, curiosity, and the free pursuit of truth, qualities that may have been embedded in us by the rebellious Enki. We must become what He may have wanted us to be, not just workers, but self-sufficient, intelligent beings capable of independently creating our reality and exploring the universe. Many theories related to the Anunnaki speak of their return, of the cyclical nature of Nibiru's orbit. Perhaps this should not be taken as an apocalyptic prophecy. Perhaps this should be seen as the final exam. Imagine that one day they return. What will they see? A planet torn by wars, inhabited by obedient consumers who still worship distorted images of their ancient masters? Or will they meet a united, grown-up civilization that has gotten rid of mental shackles, mastered clean energy, gone into space, and is ready to meet its creators not as gods, but as equals? The choice we make every day, in our thoughts, words, and deeds, determines what the answer will be. History is no longer written for us. Now we hold the pen. The legacy of the stars is within us, and it is our right and our duty to claim it. The path from black-headed slaves to sovereign citizens of the cosmos is open, and the first step on this path begins with realizing who we really are.